So how do you hug a little person? What do you call a little person? Can I say dwarf? Can I say midget? Like, what do I say? Like, I feel so uncomfortable. I don't understand the do's and the don'ts. As of May 2020, there are 650,700 dwarves in the world. That is not a large group of people. So of course, not many people will know about Dwarfism Awareness Month. So that's why I'm here. Just spit so much. That was gross. Oh, I just bit my lip. I looked online and there aren't that many videos talking about dwarfism awareness. The information isn't out there as much as it is for a lot of these other groups of minorities, obviously because there just aren't that many. What I've heard and seen a lot from people who don't really know much about dwarfism is that they think it's just, oh, they're a little bit shorter and they look funny. That's true, but that's also just not even close to it. The majority of what they have to deal with is discrimination, judgment, medical conditions, and emotionally coping with being a little person, because it comes with just so much baggage so much of the time. There's definitely a lot of progression. Obviously, like in many minority groups, there needs to be more progression and more awareness, and I just wanted to touch on a lot of the myths and a lot of the facts about dwarfism, kind of my experience, why I'm even talking about this. Hopefully this helps. All this to say, like, I just wanted to make a little video before the end of October about dwarfism awareness. And cue ambulance. Okay, so why am I talking about this? As many of you know, everyone in my family has dwarfism except for me. Sorry, it's been a really hard month. I'm gonna put you over there and not worry about checking my phone for a while. Everyone in my family has dwarfism except for me, so I'm the only average height member in my entire family, and I grew up wishing that I was a dwarf. It's just what I thought was normal, and I thought that growing up I missed a lot of experiences that other people had gotten from being raised in an average sized home. It wasn't until later I realized, wait, that's totally inaccurate. Everything I thought were my weaknesses and that I was missing out on are actually my strengths. And like, that's what made me different. That's what makes me who I am. And it took me a long time to realize that. But growing up in that dynamic was, I'm sure, hard for all parties. Like my mom and my dad, they told me if I was there first, I'd be there last. We'd go to the store and I'd be running around and hiding from them, like just to like troll them. So they could never find me.
The store will be closing in 5 minutes. Please bring your items to the checkout now.
Mom! 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 And they're like, where's Pete? He's gone, might as well go to the front now and call for him in the intercom, which was traumatizing. Pete Montzingo, please come to aisle 1. Your mother is waiting. And my brother and my sister couldn't really act like older siblings to me in the way that they kept me in line, because like I could literally walk over them, and anytime my brother would come up to me because he was mad at me for some reason, which I trolled him all the time, so I'm sure he had every right to be, I would get down on the floor, put my feet up, and slingshot him across the hall. And it's not funny. It's funny to me just because it's my brother, and it's just like I was just being such an asshole. But they couldn't really play the roles that they wanted to, and then I'm sure there was a lot of jealousy in the way where I could do a lot of the things that they couldn't do. But the funny thing is that for the most part, they were able to do anything that they wanted though. Like my brother, Mr. Montzingo on TikTok, is a basketball coach. Every summer he teaches at this camp for basketball, and he's played sports, and we did Little League together. Bruh. And you know, actually my dad was a PE teacher. He still was able to do everything that he wanted to do in his life, career-wise. A lot of people ask, how do little people meet each other? And growing up, there were these conventions we would always go to called Little People of America. And it's basically all these little people from around the US would congregate in one city every summer, which is how my brother met his wife and my mom and dad met each other. And it was so important for my family to go there and meet people like them and feel normal and play sports and stuff. For me, it was great because I get to talk to a lot of other average height siblings. I could actually relate to other people and feel normal the way that I was raised, because it was the same way that they were raised. The only downside to Little People of America is like, it was so segregated. Us tall people weren't allowed to play any of the sports except bocce. So like, that's that game that nobody knows where you like throw a ball and then whoever gets the closest to it wins, which is like the most boring sport. But I mean, It was like all the average height people did it because that's all we could do. And then every night we would have like dances, but I would always bring knee pads because I'd be on my knees the entire time on the dance floor. It's kind of just what all of us average height siblings did to try and fit into their world. So again, it was like another way where I didn't fit in, but like at the same time, like I didn't really think of it that way because I was happy that my family got to meet people and I could meet people like me as well in the same situation. A lot of my average size friends with dwarf families can also relate. We feel like we have a good understanding of a lot of things. We only know from, our lens. We don't know what it's really like, but we know how judged they are. We know how many people stare at them and point and take pictures and mock, pat them on the head and lift them up. I mean, there'd be so many people who came up to my family and we were walking in a store or eating at a restaurant or something and would just go. I would get offended immediately. And again, my family knows how to, they just ignore or whatever. But I would get right back in their face and go, jackass, to them. And I did that my whole childhood. I mean, up until I was probably like 17 because it just hurt so much. I'm like, stop staring. What are you doing? Like, why do you have to make them feel like they're not human? I mean, just like, yes, I did consistently feel like the odd one out, even though I was the normal one. It still came with a lot of perks, like I could hide things on the top shelf. I feel like I learned a lot of empathy at a young age. I learned to accept other kinds of people very early on. I think it allowed me to have friendships with like so many different kinds of people. Though I will admit sometimes when my mom tried to punish me, she would be looking up at me, like scolding me, like, sit down, sit down. I'd be like, no, why would I sit down? Like I can literally just walk away or like, give me your phone. And then like eventually like I would give her my phone. And I know a lot of people are like, well, why would you submit to that? If I was mad, then I would just walk away or do something else. But I would have felt like a complete asshole if I would have done that. Their own son would have reiterated that even he sees them like they can't do as much as they think they can, if that makes sense. So I didn't really want them to feel that way, I think, deep down, even though I was like pissed at times and wanted to keep things out of their reach. I think that's why I did it. I remember sometimes when I was like being really bad, my dad would get out the wooden spoon and hit me with it. Totally taboo now, but I mean, just being honest, that's like part of how I was raised. And I remember thinking, oh, I should probably make him think that it hurts so he doesn't think that he can't hit as hard as other parents. So I think I've always just had that thing in my head. So I just want to briefly touch on the history of dwarfism. See, this is such an underrated subject. And again, I understand why, because the population isn't so high, but like in my delusional world, of course, I'm going to think about this a lot and be passionate about it, especially when I feel guilty for not being one / sad for not being one. So confusing. Having dwarfism back in the olden days, most of the time they were just not treated like a normal human being. They were always jesters for kings and queens. So many ran away to the circus because that's the only job they could really do and find value and make money in and find a family, I'm sure, and feel like they fit in some way. They would be burned at the stake during the Salem witch trials and stuff because a lot of them were seen as being witches because they had dwarfism. And then as far as I know, like if you're a little person, like you can't give birth naturally. Maybe there are exceptions, but I think for the most part, you have to have a C-section. So back in the olden days, when a little person would get pregnant, a lot of times the mother would die or the child would die or there'd be a lot of complications. Because of that, obviously the population of dwarfism was a lot lower. A lot of people would get scared or receive invalid information from doctors who really don't know anything about dwarfism, and they would give their child up for adoption because they were scared or they didn't know how to deal with it or they didn't want to deal with it or they thought it was going to be bigger than it was. So a lot of people born with dwarfism, I mean, even now, are put up for adoption because of this reason. And I do understand like if there's complications or whatever and not being able to financially deal with it, but I have no right to talk about that because I don't know what everyone else is going through. But from my perspective, there's just a lot of false information and it's like, if we're just able to talk about this and enlighten people, then maybe things can be different. There are around 400 types of dwarfism. The ones that you probably think of when you watch TV, like Peter Dinklage from Game of Thrones and a lot of actors, they have what's called achondroplasia, which is probably the most stereotypical type of dwarfism, which is my dad's type, and then my mom's type, pseudoachondroplasia. And the difference is my dad has short arms, short legs, bigger head, and an average trunk. When I was 8, I remember I finally passed my dad in height. But when we sat down at the dinner table though, he was still taller than me. People with pseudoachondroplasia are known to have average sized heads, the rest of the body is shorter, and they develop arthritis really early on. The padding wears off in their joints. So those are the most common differences between the two. Of course, it's all a spectrum, right? My brother has a very rare form of dwarfism. Actually, they could only identify a couple others that have his type. Growing up with him, I just remember a lot of my childhood being at hospitals a lot, and Code Blue was called on him a couple times. I remember at one point we were in Los Angeles at Children's Hospital. My mom was like, okay, everyone needs to go back to school now. I'm gonna stay here with Andrew, my brother. Everything will be fine. So we were getting on the airplane with my dad, me and my sister, and right before we took off, Code Blue was being called on my brother. So they had to go back and park the plane, and we rushed off and went back to Children's Hospital. My brother had a lot of medical issues growing up, and that's also what can come with having dwarfism. Another scary part about it is that doctors don't know everything, right? They're just trained to know the most common kind of things. So there are a few specialists that specialize in dwarfism, but even then, the spectrum is so large, you can't really know everything. So in my brother's case, my mom tried a bunch of things. She was just fighting for his life, and I think it was because of her that he was able to pull through. But going through that at the time, since I was the youngest one, it was hard for me to accept everything going on with my brother. He would always have medical problems, so he'd always get the stuffed animal, or get to meet a famous person, or get special treatment, or get to eat dessert first. And me already feeling like I didn't fit in would feel that more. Now obviously as I'm older, I'm realizing, no, duh, he had mental problems. Well, that too. Andrew, if you're watching, you definitely have mental problems. Just kidding. No, but physical problems, and he needed that, especially to get through. But me being like a little kid, like, of course I'm gonna be like, what the heck? Like, I knew I should have been a dwarf. My sister was lucky enough to not have any medical problems when she was growing up, and she has achondroplasia as well. But about 8 years ago, my sister decided she wanted to straighten out her legs because she had bowed legs. So she got surgery, and she was in the hospital for months because there were metal rods literally going through her legs, which she told me to this day, like, it's the worst pain she's ever had in her life. I would visit her, and just seeing her trying to do physical therapy and walking with metal rods going through her bones in her legs was just traumatizing. But also, she's like the strongest person that I know to have been able to deal with that. Unfortunately for her, after that surgery, she was at her apartment and she was washing dishes on a step stool. She slipped and fell and got immediately rushed to the emergency room. That kind of started the first of many years that she would be in rehabs and having surgeries, and something happened during that fall that really kind of messed her up. And the doctors told her she would never be able to walk again. But it's, again, a miracle she's able to walk, but she still has a lot of medical problems that she has to live with now. So it's really sad to see a lot of this. My brother lives in South Carolina now with his wife, and they had 2 children, and they both had a 50% chance of being a little person, and they both ended up with dwarfism. So my oldest niece, Emma, who's 6 years old now, holy crap, that's so old. And she was pretty healthy, but when she was a toddler, she definitely had a little bit of medical problems. And then Olivia, who has been in the hospital, had a trach cut out for her in her neck recently. She's more like my brother, where she has more medical conditions that are more serious. It really hurts for me to see that, and I feel really bad for my brother and sister-in-law. Me being the only average height person in my family, I feel kind of obligated to help my family. Like, I just visited my dad. My dad has been healthy pretty much his whole life. It wasn't until about 8 years ago he had to have his first surgery, and that surgery kind of ended up being a spiral downhill. And like, I was in Ohio last month because his wife had to go on a trip, and my dad had just had major back surgery. His spine is just all lined with screws and rods. My dad is a really good golf player and athletic person, and he was one of 7 athletes chosen to represent the USA. My dad, what the f***? He took home medals on all 3 throws: javelin, shot put, and discus. And there he is, international legend. Man, you must be so proud of me and my TikTok dances. But now he can't do any of that again because of his condition and how his dwarfism had progressed. And it's not like he could have done anything to help that situation. It's just kind of how a lot of people who have dwarfism develop. And so I was in Ohio last month. The first night I was there, my dad fell, and we had to basically spend the rest of my trip in the hospital. He had so many muscle spasms, like almost every second. He'd be like, ah, and scream. And you know, I'm just like, oh my God, what can I do to help? I can't pick you up. Like I can't help in the way that you probably need me to help. So it was just really emotionally hard to deal with all of that, even though I wanted to deal with a lot of it. So it's interesting because as a child, I was like, oh, I want to be a dwarf. I feel like I don't fit in. But now being an adult, I'm like, how can I help? And like, I'm so glad I'm not a little person, but like, it's also, I feel this guilt of like, it's almost not fair, you know, that I ended up not a little person. I'm like my family's watching me be healthy and do all these things that they couldn't do. And I'm, you know, I know that they're happy for me, but I'm just like, man, like if I was in their position, I would be like that would suck. A lot of people don't really understand a dynamic like that, I suppose. So I don't know, I feel like it was important for me to talk about. So what is the appropriate term? Is it midget? Is it dwarf? Is it little person? What is it? Definitely not midget. Midget is derogatory because they use that term a lot when little people would be in the circus. So it's like a loaded name. It's like saying, oh, hey, look, the person who's like supposed to be at the circus. I always just say that it's a lot like saying the N-word for African American people. So what you can say is little person or dwarfism or LP. I just call them LPs, little people, just because like that's kind of like what we say in the community. But I think ideally just their name, you know, like if they're not labeled. Okay, hold on a second.
A few moments later.
Before I was rudely interrupted by the people who save other people's lives and make a difference in this world. Back to my video. So ideally, they just want to be called by their name. They don't want to be labeled as little person, dwarf, LP, midget, whatever. Yes, like it's totally relatable to be shocked when you see a little person because it's something you haven't seen, or maybe, you know, you think it's a child from the back and you're like, oh, why are you driving? Or, you know, at least from my perspective, like I could understand why somebody would do that, but it's when it goes to the next step, which is trying to sneak a picture or just being naive. I actually have an example for this. The amount of times my dad has been mistaken for Peter Dinklage from Game of Thrones has been way more than I can count. Last time he visited me in LA, we went to Hollywood and we were just walking around and they have those Hollywood tour buses and they're like, oh, ride with us and we'll show you where celebrities live and like the historic things in Hollywood. One was passing by us. The driver of the bus said, oh, look, it's Peter Dinklage from Game of Thrones. And everybody like thought it was true, took out their cameras. My dad is just so used to this that he just sat there and he started waving. He's like, hi, $5 an autograph, which is amazing. But you know, deep down, I'm sure he was just feeling like people can't see him for just himself and who he is, and that he is his own person. Like people just group a lot of little people together. People come up to my mom all the time and, you know, they tell her that she's really cute and everything. And she's just like, you know, she's like, thank you. I mean, that's really sweet, thank you. But still in her mind, like that means there's some sort of pet. Oh, you're so cute and cuddly and I just wanna like, you know, hold you like a stuffed animal and squeeze you to death. And she's like, I'm a grown woman and I don't wanna have to be cute all the time. Here's a pretty good video that I made with my mom about how to interact with a little person on the street. Okay, now here's another video I made about the correct way to hug a little person. A lot of people ask me, well, what were the chances of you being a little person? Or what are the chances that you're gonna have a little person if you have kids? So I made a video about this as well. Here it is. I get told all the time,
I'm under 4'10", so technically I'm a dwarf.
You are wrong. You're probably just short. Sorry. Dwarfism isn't about height. It's actually about genetic mutation. So unless you have dwarf parents, you have a 0.004% chance of popping out a dwarf. I had a 75% chance of being a dwarf. But when I was in the womb, they could only check if I had my dad's type of dwarfism, achondroplasia. But if I was gonna be like my mom's type, pseudo-achondroplasia, then I wouldn't have showed signs until I was like 2 years old. So when I popped out half my mom's size, technically I could have still been a dwarf. But if you ask my mom, she was confident that she was gonna have an average sized kid. Apparently I was just super hyper in her womb, whatever that means. Sadly, I ended up not a dwarf, so I don't have the gene, which means I have the same chance as you of having a dwarf baby, unless I have a baby with a dwarf, which I could never do because the thought of that makes me feel like it's a family member. So yes, I will have the same chance as you of having a little person child, which is crazy because I can't imagine having a family without little people, but then I also can't imagine being with a little person. I don't know. I don't know what's happening in there, but clearly I'm still working through a lot of issues. And see, my situation was unique because it's not that common to have an all little people family and be the only tall one. In reality, 80% of little people are born into average height families. That's what happened with my mom and that's what happened with my dad. My dad had 5 brothers who were all 6'4", 6'5". My dad is 4'8", which kind of makes sense why he's the second tallest dwarf in the world, or used to be, because all of his brothers were giants. So he's still a giant for being a little person. And that makes sense why I'm so tall, is because I probably inherited that from his brothers. So it makes sense, but it doesn't. My dad though was raised as just one of the boys. His mom and dad decided like, we're not gonna treat you any different, which really taught my dad that he can do anything himself. My mom, on the other hand, her mom and dad did not know what to expect. And again, she has pseudo-achondroplasia. So everything was fine until she was around 2 years old, and then she started having medical conditions. And at the time, my grandma and grandpa were like, what is this? We don't know. They went to, these doctors that didn't really know much about dwarfism, telling them incorrect information that my mom will be mentally ill, that she's gonna struggle with never walking again. And it scared my grandpa and grandma so much that they thought it'd be best for her to put her in a special kind of school, and also to try like new age experiments at the time, which actually ended up twisting her bones. Basically what I'm trying to say is, like, back then, people didn't really know how to deal with this. They didn't know much about it. So here's my dad growing up in a way where he's like, yeah, I'm pretty much just like everyone else. And then my mom growing up with, okay, like I went through all these like experiments and I'm kind of traumatized from them, and like I feel like I'm different. Both are so valid and both happen so much. And there's not a right way or a wrong way. So when my mom and dad were raising my brother and sister, they were able to use their different experiences to raise them in the way that they thought would be best for having dwarfism. So that's why my house had a lot of step stools, lower counters, lower furniture. The toilet was really low. One sink in the house though was my sink. So as soon as they realized I was gonna be average height, they just left that one there. So it's like my brother and sister had the small one to the side here. Then I had like the one that was average height. But the funny thing is I'm so tall, taller than normal. I was even taller than the average one. So it was just this totally crazy like situation. My brother and sister just had a twin bed growing up because that's all they need. But my feet were dangling off the twin bed. And I mean, I just kind of thought that that's how it went. It wasn't until I moved out that I was like, oh, I need a queen size bed, But you just don't think about it because they've never had to deal with that before. And so all these experiences that my family has had, especially my mom and my dad, they've always told me, like, growing up, you're so lucky to fit in. You're not gonna have all the eyes on you. Like, it's a blessing. Like, you don't wanna be stared at everywhere you go. You don't wanna be sticking out like a sore thumb. But, me growing up the way I did, like, they don't understand that, like, that's how I feel like I need to be because that's what I saw happening with them. They're the ones getting remembered at the grocery store and at doctor's offices. And I always have to reintroduce myself because no one ever remembers me. I mean, that really gets on me. And I'm sure that's a big reason why I now live in LA and I'm posting content, is because I think there's a part of me that feels like I need to do that to fit into this world. Okay, well, that's getting super deep. We won't get there today. Here's the underlying message about Dwarfism Awareness Month. They want to be treated like everyone else, and they just want people to understand who they are and where they come from. Just more education around the subject, because people still think that dwarfism isn't real. Like, I mean, even like not even 5 years ago, I was talking to somebody that I just met. I was like, yeah, my whole family are little people, like dwarfs, except for me. And they were like laughing, like, yeah, dwarfism isn't real. I'm just like, yes, it is. And And I showed them a picture of my family, and they like almost passed out because they couldn't believe that mythical creatures exist. I'm like, this isn't a mythical creature. This is a genetic mutation. It's the same as somebody having some sort of genetic disorder. There are people who go through their day feeling all that judgment and getting asked questions all the time. Well, how do you drive? Can you have kids? Can you actually get married? Okay, like those are valid questions. But like if you were a little person and you got asked that several times a day for like 50 years, wouldn't at some point you'd be like, can you just Google it? Or like, how do you not know this yet? It's not talked about enough. And I just think it's important to talk about. I found myself in a really interesting situation a couple years ago because my friend invited me to his friend's birthday party, and we get there and his friend had hired a dwarf stripper. She popped out of the cake and she was stripping, and everyone was like throwing things at her, and then they started throwing her around, and she's like, ah! I feel like when I'm seeing a dwarf stripper, I'm envisioning a family member. So I'm like, oh, I don't want to see. I don't know if she wanted to do that, if she felt pressured to do that, if she didn't care. I think I did like a Twitter post about it when I was there. If I can find it, I'll put it right here. It makes me so sad to see a lot of these little people feel like they have to get into jobs that are degrading because that's where the money is, or maybe they couldn't get any other job. You know, maybe they genuinely like it or they don't care, which is fine. You know, I'm not a little person. I have no right to correct them or tell them they're right or wrong. Like, they have every right to their opinion, 100%. When I was a kid, my mom and my dad, every St. Patrick's Day, they would dress up as leprechauns. They did a lot of like commercials and postcards and things that involved being a little person. And I know now things are changing because now people are like, it's not fair. We're not just one-dimensional. That's not just who we are. Like, we are people as well, and we can do anything essentially. And that's why I think Peter Dinklage is just such an awesome advocate for dwarfism, because he plays a lot of characters that don't need to be little people. So I'm sure there's a lot that I left out. I hope that brought a little bit of clarity. If not, like, I get it too, because I just threw up so many things and emotions and facts that I don't even know how I'm gonna edit this, to be honest. It's gonna be a nightmare. And I just wanted to do something for Dwarfism Awareness Month because it is important to me and my family and my friends. And even though it might not affect you right now, and you're like, okay, I don't really need to know this information, there will be a time in your life where you will meet a little person or you'll walk by one. And now hopefully you'll have the tools to kind of relate to them a little bit more and understand where they came from and why they are the way they are. Along with so many other minority groups, I just think dwarfism is just as important, even though there's less of a population. So that's all I gotta say. I love you guys so much. Thank you for watching this. And I'm not gonna tell you to subscribe because I hate it when YouTubers do that. But I will say, if there's anything else that you wanna know, or if you have any other questions, please write them in the comments, because I mean, you guys ask questions that totally are valid that I'm like, oh yeah, why didn't I ever bring that up? That's such an important question that I just wouldn't think would be a question because I'm just so close to it. So don't feel embarrassed. And if you're a little person and you're watching this, hopefully I did the topic justice. If not, let me know. I love you guys.
Bye, have a great time.